You'll stop thinking about that person after you find this out. You already know what it feels like. It is 3 in the morning and your mind refuses to be quiet. You are not choosing to think about them. You are not doing it on purpose. But there they are, again, filling the space between sleep and waking, between one breath and the next. You replay a conversation. You reread an old message in your head. You construct scenarios that will never happen and feel the grief of losing something that was never fully yours to begin with. You tell yourself it will pass. It always says it will pass. But it keeps coming back. And somewhere inside you, you have started to wonder if something is wrong with you. If you are weaker than other people. If you are more broken. You are not broken. And nothing is wrong with you. But something important is happening inside you. Something the obsession is pointing toward. Something that has very little to do with that person and everything to do with you. There is a reason your mind keeps returning to them. There is a reason this particular person lodged themselves so deeply into your thoughts. And that reason is not what you think it is. Most people assume that the inability to stop thinking about someone is a sign of how much they love them, how deeply that person mattered, how irreplaceable the connection was. And while love is real and connection is real and loss is real, the story of why certain people occupy the mind with such relentless persistence is far more layered than love alone. It is a story about the mind itself, about the nervous system, about wounds that existed long before that person arrived, about needs that have been waiting, sometimes for decades, to finally be seen. What you are about to understand will not erase the feeling immediately. Real shifts in perception rarely do. But it will change the way you see what is happening inside you. And once you truly see it, the hold begins to loosen. Not because you forced it, but because you finally understood it. There is a particular kind of suffering that comes from not knowing why you feel what you feel. When the pain is nameless, it is boundless. It expands to fill every available space. It follows you into rooms where it does not belong. It colors conversations that have nothing to do with it. It makes ordinary moments feel unbearable because underneath every ordinary moment, the ache is still there, unaddressed, unnamed, unresolved. And the worst part is not the pain itself. The worst part is the confusion that surrounds it, the sense that you should be over this by now. The quiet shame of still caring about someone who has moved on, or who never fully arrived in the first place. The private embarrassment of checking their profile one more time, of finding reasons to bring them up in conversation, of dreaming about them even when your waking mind has committed to letting go. Naming what is happening does not make the pain disappear, but it gives you something to work with. It transforms something shapeless and overwhelming into something you can actually examine, understand, and eventually move through. And there is a specific kind of relief that comes from understanding, a loosening in the chest, a softening of the grip, that cannot be achieved through distraction or time alone. This is not a video about forgetting someone. Forgetting is not the goal. The goal is understanding what your mind is actually doing and why it has chosen this particular obsession to deliver a message you have been waiting to hear for a very long time. Stay with this, all the way through. Because the truth that is waiting at the end of this video is one you will recognize the moment you hear it, and recognition is where everything changes. The trap of the mind. The first thing most people do when they want to stop thinking about someone is try harder to stop. They distract themselves. They stay busy. They tell themselves not to think about it over and over until the instruction itself becomes a reminder, and the reminder becomes an intrusion, and the intrusion becomes the very thing they were trying to escape. There is a psychological phenomenon called ironic process theory. It describes something simple and devastating. The more actively you try to suppress a thought, the more frequently that thought returns. Telling your mind not to think about something requires your mind to first identify what not to think about. And in doing so, it keeps the thought active, close, ready to surface at the slightest trigger. The instruction to forget becomes the mechanism of remembrance. Think about what happens when someone tells you not to think about a white bear. The moment the instruction lands, the white bear is already there. You cannot unsummon it. The very act of defining what to avoid creates a mental bookmark, a flag in the system that says, "Return here." And so the mind returns. Not because it is cruel, because that is precisely how suppression works. The mind is not your enemy in this process. It is simply following its own logic, a logic that prioritizes unresolved material above all else. This is not a flaw in your character. It is not weakness or obsession in the clinical sense. It is the mind doing exactly what it was built to do, monitoring for threats, flagging unresolved material, returning again and again to what has not been processed. Your mind is not torturing you. It is trying to finish something. The problem is that most people respond to this loop with more force, more suppression, more urgency to make it stop. And the urgency feeds the loop, which feeds the urgency, and the cycle deepens. What started as a thought becomes a habit of thought. What was a feeling becomes a pattern, and the person who triggered it all becomes a permanent resident in mental space they were never meant to occupy. There is also something else happening in this loop that rarely gets named. Every time the thought of that person returns and you resist it, you create a small internal conflict. A war between what the mind is doing and what you want it to do. And internal conflict is exhausting in a way that is different from ordinary tiredness. It drains the system not through effort, but through resistance. Through the constant low-grade tension of fighting something that keeps coming back no matter how many times you push it away. That exhaustion is real, and it compounds over time. The longer the loop continues, the more depleted you become, and the more depleted you become, the less capacity you have to actually process what is driving the loop in the first place. It becomes a cycle not just of thought but of emotional depletion, which is why people who have been unable to stop thinking about someone for weeks or months often describe a kind of fog, a heaviness that has nothing to do with sleep, a tiredness that rest does not fix. Because the source of the tiredness is not physical. It is the ongoing energy cost of an unresolved internal conflict. It is what happens when the mind is asked to do two opposing things at once: feel and not feel, remember and forget, care and detach, without any of those commands being fully followed or fully released. Understanding this changes everything about how you approach what you are going through. You cannot fight your way out of this. You cannot discipline your mind into silence on this particular subject, not through force alone, and not before you understand what the mind is actually trying to resolve. The trap is not the thought. The trap is the war against the thought. And the first act of real freedom is not suppressing the loop, but getting curious about what it is trying to tell you, because it is telling you something. Something precise, something personal, something that goes much deeper than a person you miss. The illusion you are actually attached to. Here is the question almost no one asks. Are you actually attached to that person, or are you attached to what they made you feel? Sit with that for a moment, because the answer changes everything. When you close your eyes and think about them, what is it that you miss? Is it them specifically, their complexity, their contradictions, their full and imperfect human reality? Or is it something they gave you access to? A feeling of being chosen, a version of yourself that felt more alive, a sense of possibility that existed in the space between you, a moment, even brief, when you felt like you belonged to something. Most people, when they sit honestly with this question, discover that they cannot actually describe the person they miss with much precision. They can describe how they felt in that person's presence. They can describe the texture of the connection, the emotional temperature of the relationship, the specific quality of attention that person gave them. But the person themselves, as a full, complex, separate human being with their own contradictions and limitations and inner world, remains somewhat blurry. This is not a failure of love. It is a clue about what the attachment was actually organized around. This is not because you are shallow. It is because the mind does not archive relationships the way a camera archives images. It archives feelings. It stores the emotional residue of experiences, the way certain moments made the nervous system respond, the way certain presences made the body relax or contract, expand or protect itself. The person becomes inseparable from the feeling, and so losing the person feels like losing the feeling, and losing the feeling feels unbearable. The mind is not sentimental in the way we like to believe. It does not store people as whole beings. It stores experiences, feelings, sensations, associations. It stores the version of reality that existed when that person was present. And when they leave, or when the connection changes, what the mind mourns is not always them. What it mourns is the feeling, the access, the reflection. This is not a cynical idea. It is actually a deeply compassionate one, because it means that what you are longing for is not out of reach. It means the longing itself is pointing toward something real that you need, something valid and human and deeply yours. It is just that you have confused the source with the need. You do not miss them as much as you miss feeling seen. You do not miss them as much as you miss feeling like your presence mattered to someone. You do not miss them as much as you miss the version of yourself that showed up when they were around, the one who felt lighter or more real or finally understood. And that version of yourself did not disappear when they left. You just stopped believing in it without someone else there to reflect it back. There is something quietly devastating about this realization, and something quietly liberating about it at the same time. Devastating, because it means the relationship was never entirely about the other person. Liberating, because it means that what you are searching for is not imprisoned inside someone else's choices or availability or feelings about you. It exists within you. It always did. The connection you had simply gave you temporary access to something you had not yet learned to access on your own. The attachment is not to a person. The attachment is to a feeling of aliveness, of worth, of safety, that you have not yet learned to access independently. That is what the obsession is really protecting. That is what it is really asking you to find. The wound that was already there. They did not create the wound, they found it. This is one of the most important things you will ever understand about the people who affect you most deeply. The ones who get under your skin, who live in your mind long after they are gone, who leave a mark that feels disproportionate to the length of time you knew them. These people did not cause the depth of what you feel. They activated something that was already there waiting, shaped by experiences that happened long before they entered your life. Think of it this way. The wound is an old groove in the landscape of your emotional world. Most people walk through your life without touching it. They move across the surface and leave no particular trace. But then someone comes along whose energy, whose way of moving through the world, whose way of looking at you or not looking at you, fits precisely into that groove. And the moment they land there, something deep in the nervous system recognizes it. Not as pain at first, as familiarity, as intensity, as meaning. This is why certain connections feel like destiny. It is not because the universe selected that person for you. It is because something in your unresolved emotional history recognized a pattern in them that matched something old, something formative, something you never fully healed from. The feeling of recognition was real, but what was being recognized was not your future. It was your wound. Emotional wounds from early life, experiences of abandonment, of not being enough, of love being conditional, of safety being unreliable. These do not disappear with time. They go underground. They become part of the invisible architecture of your emotional world, shaping what you are drawn to, what you fear, what makes you feel safe, and what makes you brace for impact. They operate beneath the level of conscious choice. And they are extraordinarily patient. They can wait years, sometimes decades, for the right person to come along and press exactly the right place. When the right person comes along, the one who mirrors that old dynamic with enough precision, the wound resurfaces with a force that feels completely new, but is actually ancient. The intensity of what you feel is not only about this person. It is the accumulated weight of every time the original wound was touched and never healed. Every time you reached for connection, and it was pulled away. Every time love came with conditions you could never quite meet. Every time you were made to feel that your presence was conditional, that belonging had a price, that you had to earn the right to be loved. This is why the grief you feel is sometimes larger than the relationship itself. You are not only grieving this person, you are grieving everything they reactivated. Every time you felt not enough. Every time connection was taken away. Every time you reached for something and it disappeared. The current loss is real, but it is also a portal to every unresolved loss that came before it. And the mind, trying to process all of it at once, loops endlessly, because the material it is working with is not just from this relationship, it is from a lifetime. Understanding this does not make the pain smaller, but it makes it make sense. And when pain makes sense, it begins to move. It stops being a punishment and starts being information. Information about where healing is needed. Information about what has been waiting beneath the surface, for you to finally turn toward it with something other than avoidance. The pain was never your enemy. It was always a messenger. And like all messengers, it only keeps knocking until you open the door. The neuroscience of not forgetting. Your brain is not being irrational. It is being biological. Every time you thought about that person with hope, every time a message arrived, every time there was a moment of closeness or possibility, your brain released dopamine. Not because they were objectively good for you, but because they represented an unpredictable reward. And the brain is not drawn to what is consistent. It is drawn to what is uncertain. This is one of the most sobering truths about human attachment. The intermittent reinforcement of a relationship, the moments of closeness followed by distance, the warmth followed by coldness, the almost but not quite. These patterns do not make the brain detach. They make it hold on more intensely. The uncertainty does not signal danger to the reward system. It signals potential, and the brain chases potential with the same biochemistry it uses to chase survival. Researchers who study reward pathways in the brain have found that unpredictable rewards activate the dopamine system far more powerfully than predictable ones. A reward that arrives every single time eventually becomes background noise. But a reward that arrives sometimes unpredictably keeps the system on high alert. The brain dedicates enormous resources to monitoring for the next possible reward, analyzing patterns, replaying past experiences in search of clues about when the reward might arrive again. This is the same mechanism behind gambling addiction. The slot machine does not pay every time. It pays just often enough to keep the player at the machine. And the person who made you feel everything did not always show up fully. They showed up just often enough to keep you waiting. Apply this to a relationship where connection was inconsistent, where warmth came and went without a clear pattern, where you never quite knew where you stood, and you begin to understand why the mind cannot simply switch off. It is not in love with the person so much as it is locked into a reward-seeking loop that was established during the relationship and did not automatically deactivate when the relationship ended. Cortisol is also part of this equation. When the connection became painful or unstable, your stress response activated. Cortisol flooded the system, heightening attention, sharpening focus, directing all cognitive resources toward the source of the perceived threat. The source, in this case, was that person, or rather, the uncertainty surrounding them. And so the brain, in an attempt to resolve the threat, kept returning to them, analyzing, replaying, trying to find the pattern that would make things predictable and therefore safe. You are not weak for not being able to stop thinking about them. You are experiencing a biochemical process that was designed for survival, now being applied to an emotional experience your nervous system classified as urgent. The person became, at some level, a survival signal, not consciously, not logically, but in the language of the nervous system. They represented something the body believed it needed to remain emotionally intact, and the nervous system does not respond to logical arguments about why you should be fine. It responds to evidence, to repeated experiences of safety, to new patterns that gradually replace the old ones. This is why telling yourself to simply move on rarely works. You are not dealing with a choice, you are dealing with a deeply conditioned biological response. The work is not to shame the response. The work is to understand it clearly enough that you can begin to offer the nervous system something the other person no longer can. The signal that you are safe, that you are stable, and that you do not require their presence to remain whole. That signal cannot be delivered through willpower. It is delivered through consistent, gentle, repeated acts of self-regulation. Through learning, slowly and imperfectly, to be the stable presence in your own life that you were seeking from someone else. And each time you successfully regulate your own emotional state, Each time you soothe yourself without reaching for their memory as a crutch, you are rewriting the biological script. You are teaching the nervous system a new language, one that does not require them to speak. The story you keep rewriting. There is a version of events playing on repeat in your mind. You know the one. You have watched it hundreds of times. You change the words, shift the moments, rewrite the ending. Sometimes you say what you never said. Sometimes they say what you needed to hear. Sometimes the version you are watching is the worst one, the one where everything falls apart in slow motion, and you observe yourself losing something you can barely name. This mental replay is not nostalgia. It is not sentimentality. It is the mind's attempt to achieve something it never got, resolution. The human brain has a powerful drive toward narrative completion. When a story ends without a satisfying conclusion, when a relationship closes without real closure, when something important is left unspoken or unexplained, the mind does not simply file it away. It flags it as unfinished. And unfinished things demand attention. They interrupt sleep, intrude on ordinary moments, resurface without warning. Not to torture you, to complete the arc. Psychologists sometimes call this the Zeigarnik effect, the mind's tendency to remember and return to incomplete tasks far more readily than completed ones. A finished story settles. An unfinished story stays active in working memory, available and recurring, because the mind has not yet received the signal that it is safe to let it go. Completion is the signal, and without it, the loop continues, and the story plays again, slightly altered, endlessly searching for the version that finally feels finished. The problem is that the mind keeps trying to find resolution through the same material, replaying the same scenes, adding slightly different dialogue, trying out alternate endings. But the raw material does not change because the events already happened, and so the resolution never actually arrives. The loop continues, and with each repetition it becomes slightly more entrenched, slightly more automatic, until it begins to feel less like a choice and more like a reflex. What makes this particularly painful is that the replays often feel productive. They feel like processing, like working through something. And in some ways they are, in the early stages, allowing yourself to return to what happened is part of how the mind begins to metabolize experience. But when the replays repeat without any new insight, without any new meaning, without any shift in how you see what happened, they are no longer processing. They are circling. And circling is not the same as moving. Circling keeps you in the same place while giving the sensation of forward motion. It is one of the mind's most convincing and most exhausting illusions. What the mind does not know, or perhaps what it has not yet been taught, is that the closure it is searching for cannot be found inside the story. It cannot be extracted from the memories or the replays or the imagined conversations. Closure is not something the other person gives you. It is not something the past provides. Closure is a decision you make about the meaning of what happened. It is an interpretation, not an event. The moment you stop waiting for the story to end differently and start understanding what the story was always trying to teach you, the replay loses its urgency. Not because the pain disappears, but because the mind has finally found what it was looking for. Not a new ending. An understanding of the one that already exists. An understanding, real understanding that settles into the body and not just the intellect, is the only form of closure that actually holds. The self-image locked inside the obsession. This chapter asks something that might be uncomfortable. Who were you when you were with them? Not who they thought you were. Not the role they placed you in. Who did you feel like? What parts of yourself showed up that felt more real, more alive, more like the person you had always suspected you could be? Were you funnier, freer, more open? Did you feel more creative, more seen, more like you finally mattered to someone in the specific way you had always needed to matter? Because here is what is rarely said about the loss of someone. Part of what you are mourning is not them. It is that version of yourself. When a person leaves or when a connection ends, they do not only take themselves, they take the context in which a certain version of you existed. And if that version felt more like your true self than the one you carry through ordinary days, the loss becomes layered in a way that is almost impossible to articulate. You are grieving them. but you are also grieving a self-image, a sense of who you were capable of being, that now feels inaccessible. This grief is rarely acknowledged because it sounds strange to say out loud. It sounds like you are making someone else's departure about yourself. But it is not strange. It is one of the most human experiences there is. We do not exist in isolation. Who we are shifts in relation to who we are with. Different people draw out different parts of us, and some people, rare and significant, draw out parts of us that feel more real than anything we had accessed before. When those people leave, the loss is not only external, it is internal. A part of the self goes quiet. Not permanently, but quietly enough that the silence is deafening. This is why some connections, even painful ones, even ones that were ultimately wrong for you, leave a mark that seems out of proportion. Because they briefly showed you something. They gave you a glimpse of a version of yourself you had been waiting to meet, and then they disappeared, and you did not know how to find that version of yourself without them as the mirror. The mirror metaphor is important here. When someone reflects back a version of you that feels truer, more vibrant, more real, you begin to depend on that reflection. Without it, you start to question whether that version of yourself was real at all. Was I actually that person? Or was I just performing for their attention? Was the aliveness real? Or was it borrowed? And the uncertainty about your own selfhood compounds the grief of losing the relationship. It makes the loss feel like more than a loss of connection. It feels like a loss of self. But here is the truth that changes the weight of this. That version of you was not a product of their presence. You were the one who showed up. You were the one who brought that aliveness into the room. They were the trigger, but the capacity was always yours. What you are actually longing for is not them. You are longing for permission to be that version of yourself, without needing anyone to authorize it. And that permission is not something another person can ever truly give you. Every time it comes from outside, it creates dependency. Every time it comes from inside, it creates freedom. It is something you give yourself, and the moment you begin to give it consistently, without waiting for someone else to arrive and make it feel justified, something in you settles into a groundedness that no relationship, however beautiful, could ever fully provide on its own. The familiar stranger. There is a particular kind of person who feels like home the moment you meet them. Something about their energy, the way they speak, the way they look at you or move through a room, lands somewhere inside you that is warm and familiar and deeply personal. You feel like you have known them before. You feel an inexplicable pull, a sense of recognition that logic cannot fully explain. This feeling is real, but what is being recognized is not what most people assume. Attachment research developed over decades by psychologists studying the way early bonds shape adult relationships reveals something that is both illuminating and unsettling. We are drawn to what is familiar, not because it is good for us, but because it matches the emotional architecture we were built in. The patterns established in our earliest relationships, the ways love was expressed or withheld, the conditions under which we felt safe or afraid, these patterns become the template against which all future connections are measured. A person who replicates that template, even unconsciously, even if the pattern involves pain, feels recognizable at a level beneath thought. The nervous system does not distinguish between familiar and safe. It only registers familiar. And familiar, regardless of what it contains, feels like belonging. The child who grew up with a parent who was emotionally inconsistent, warm one moment and distant the next, present in body but absent in attention, learns to read that emotional volatility as love. Not because it is love, but because it is what love felt like during the years when the nervous system was being calibrated. And so, decades later, that adult finds themselves powerfully drawn to partners who are emotionally inconsistent, not because they want to suffer, because the nervous system recognizes the pattern and interprets the recognition as connection. The heart races not from joy but from familiarity, and in the body the two can feel identical. This is why so many people find themselves repeatedly drawn to the same emotional dynamic, different faces, different names, same essential feeling. It is not coincidence. It is not bad luck. It is the attachment system doing exactly what it was designed to do. Seek out the known, return to the template, attempt to resolve the original story through a new cast of characters. The unconscious hope embedded in this pattern is poignant when you see it clearly. Some part of you believes that if you can make this person, the one who feels so familiar, finally choose you fully, finally stay, finally offer the consistent love that the original source withheld, then the old wound will heal. The old story will end differently. The part of you that was not enough will finally be proven wrong. The person you cannot stop thinking about may have felt like a soulmate. They may have felt predestined, cosmically arranged, and in a sense, they were arranged. Not by the universe, but by your own unconscious emotional history, which selected them precisely because they fit the shape of something unfinished. This does not diminish what you felt. What you felt was real. But understanding where the feeling comes from gives you something invaluable, the awareness to choose differently next time, to recognize the pull not as fate, but as a map of what still needs healing, and to understand that the healing is not found by finally getting that person to stay. It is found by learning to give yourself what you were always hoping they would provide. It is found by becoming, for yourself, the consistent and loving presence that the original wound taught you to seek everywhere except within. The need beneath the need. Strip everything away. Remove the memories, the replays, the imagined futures. Remove the specific sound of their voice and the particular way they looked at you in that one moment you keep returning to. Remove everything until you reach the absolute core of what you are missing. What is there? For most people, what remains is not a person. What remains is a feeling. A very specific, very personal feeling that this person, at some point and in some way, gave you access to. It might be the feeling of being truly seen, of having your inner world recognized and received without judgment. It might be the feeling of being chosen, of mattering enough to someone that they reached for you specifically, out of everyone else. It might be the feeling of safety, of being able to exist without performing, without bracing, without holding parts of yourself back in anticipation of rejection. It might simply be the feeling of being enough, not almost enough, not enough if you change, but enough exactly as you are. These are not small things. They are among the deepest needs a human being carries. And when someone comes along who, even briefly and even imperfectly, provides access to those feelings, the psyche does not register them as a person, it registers them as a source. And when the source disappears, the need does not disappear with it. It intensifies. There is a particular cruelty in this dynamic that deserves to be named. When a person gives you intermittent access to a feeling you have been hungry for, they do not satisfy the need. They amplify it. The brief moments of feeling chosen make the moments of not feeling chosen more unbearable by contrast. The times you felt truly seen make the times you felt invisible more painful. The presence of what you needed, offered inconsistently, creates a heightened awareness of its absence, and so the longing deepens not in spite of the connection, but because of it. The obsession is not about the person. The obsession is about the need the person temporarily fulfilled. And the reason it is so hard to let go is not because of who they are. It is because letting go feels, to some part of you, like surrendering the only access point you have ever known to a feeling you have needed your entire life. This is where so much suffering lives, not in the loss of a human being, but in the belief that the thing they gave you cannot be found anywhere else, cannot be generated internally, cannot exist without them as the source. That belief, deeply held and rarely examined, is what keeps the loop alive long after the relationship has ended. But that belief is not true. It is only old. And old beliefs, no matter how deeply they are held, are not facts. They are conclusions drawn from incomplete information, from a younger version of you who did not yet have the resources, the perspective, or the self-knowledge to find that feeling from within. The information is about to become more complete. The younger version of you was doing the best they could with what they had. But you are not that version anymore. The resources available to you now are different, and the most important resource is the one you are building right now. The willingness to look clearly at what is actually happening inside you, without flinching, and without running away. That willingness is not weakness. It is the most courageous thing a person can do. To stay present with your own pain long enough to finally understand what it is asking for. The moment the loop breaks. You have been waiting for something to make it stop. Time, maybe. Distance. A new person. The right distraction. Some revelation that finally cuts the thread. You have been waiting for the loop to end from the outside, for something external to reach in and dissolve what lives inside you. But the loop does not break from the outside. It never did. The loop breaks at the moment you stop needing them to give you what only you can give yourself. That sentence sounds simple. It is not, because for it to actually happen, for the shift to be real and not just intellectual, something has to change at a level beneath the mind. The part of you that classified this person as a source of something essential, worthy, chosen, safe, real. That part has to encounter evidence that the source was never external to begin with. This does not happen through willpower. It does not happen through journaling 3 times a week, or telling yourself affirmations you do not yet believe. It does not happen by staying busy enough that you never have to sit with the silence. All of those strategies have their place, but none of them address the root. None of them reach the part of the nervous system that is still broadcasting the signal that something essential is missing, and that the person who left was the only one who could provide it. What actually reaches that part is experience. Specific, repeated, embodied experience of a different reality. The experience of sitting with a difficult feeling and surviving it. Not just enduring it, but actually moving through it and arriving on the other side still intact. The experience of noticing your own pain and responding to it with care instead of judgment. The experience of making a decision from a place of self-respect and feeling the quiet steadiness that follows. The experience of being alone and discovering that the silence is not, in fact, unbearable. That it is, in fact, full of something that was always there beneath the noise. Every time you sit with a difficult feeling instead of running from it, you are breaking the loop. Every time you acknowledge your own pain with the same tenderness you would offer a person you love, you are breaking the loop. Every time you make a decision from a place of self-respect rather than longing, you are breaking the loop. Every time you choose to be present in your own life instead of living inside a memory, you are breaking the loop. The loop breaks not with a dramatic realization but with accumulated acts of self-return. Small, quiet, consistent moments of choosing yourself. Not because you have stopped caring about them, but because you have started caring about you. And those moments accumulate. They build something, layer by layer, slowly and often imperceptibly. They construct a new foundation. One that does not depend on any particular person's presence to remain standing. And at some point, without a precise timestamp, without a moment you can point to and say it happened right there, you will notice that they are not the first thing in your mind when you wake up. You will notice that the day passed, and you did not replay the story once. You will notice that a song came on that used to undo you, and this time it was just a song. You will notice that the silence where they used to live is not empty anymore. It is inhabited by something steadier, something that does not require another person to sustain it. That steadiness is you, rebuilt, returned to yourself, and more real than any obsession ever was, the person you become. There is a version of you on the other side of this, not harder, not closed, not someone who has decided that attachment is too dangerous and people are not worth the risk. That would not be healing. That would be armor. And armor is just pain wearing a different shape. The version of you that emerges from genuinely moving through this is someone who has learned something most people never learn. That the love you were searching for in another person was always, at its most essential level, a conversation you needed to have with yourself. This does not mean you will stop wanting connection. Human beings are wired for it. The need for belonging, for intimacy, for being truly known by another person, these are not weaknesses to be overcome. They are part of what it means to be alive. But there is a difference between seeking connection from wholeness and seeking connection to fill a void. One feels like reaching toward something beautiful. The other feels like drowning and reaching for anything that floats. The person you are becoming knows the difference. Not because they read it somewhere or heard it in a video and agreed with it intellectually, but because they have felt the difference from the inside. They have experienced what it is to confuse a source of healing with a person. They have lived through the loop. They have sat in the silence when the distraction ran out. They have returned to themselves, again and again, when every instinct said to reach for something external instead. And they have done the work of finding, slowly and imperfectly, what they were looking for inside themselves all along. This kind of inner work leaves a mark. But unlike the marks left by obsession and longing, this mark is generative. It becomes knowledge that cannot be unlearned, a form of self-understanding that goes bone deep, an intimacy with your own emotional landscape that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You will know things about yourself that people who never faced this kind of pain will never know. Not because suffering is inherently enlightening, but because you chose to turn toward the suffering rather than away from it. And in turning toward it, you discovered what was living underneath. You discovered that you were more resilient than you knew, more complex than you had given yourself credit for, more capable of genuine self-compassion than any relationship had ever required you to be. That person carries a different kind of confidence, not the performed confidence of someone who pretends not to need anyone, but the quiet, grounded confidence of someone who knows that their worth is not conditional on being chosen, that their reality does not require another person's validation to be real, that their sense of belonging does not collapse when a relationship ends. They enter new connections without the invisible weight of unhealed needs pressing against every interaction. They can be present with another person without secretly making that person responsible for their sense of self. They can love without losing themselves. They can care deeply without dissolving. They can feel the pull of connection without mistaking intensity for health or familiarity for love. And the relationships they attract and the relationships they choose reflect that, because the world tends to mirror back the relationship you have with yourself. When the relationship you have with yourself is one of patience, honesty, and genuine care, the connections that find their way to you begin to carry those same qualities, not as a magical reward for inner work, but as a natural consequence of the fact that you have changed what you are available for, what you are willing to accept, and what you recognize as real love versus what you recognize as a familiar wound wearing a new face. The truth that was always yours. Finally, here is the truth. The feeling you have been chasing through that person, the one that lives at the center of everything you have replayed and longed for and grieved, was never something only they could give you. It was never inside them, waiting to be transferred. It was always yours. It was always generated from within you, in response to a presence that temporarily gave you permission to access it. You felt seen because something in you opened and allowed itself to be seen. You felt chosen because something in you believed, in that moment, that you were worth choosing. You felt alive because you let yourself be present in a way that ordinary days do not always invite. The feeling was real. It was just misattributed. You gave them the credit for something you did. This is a disorienting thing to sit with, because we are taught to think of love and connection as things that happen to us, that arrive from outside, that depend on the other person's willingness to provide them. And there is truth in that. Other people matter. Connection is real. The specific quality of a bond between two people is irreducible and not entirely self-generated. But the capacity to feel, the capacity to open, the capacity to be present and real and alive in someone's company, that capacity is yours. It lives in you. It travels with you. And it does not require that particular person in order to be activated. This is the moment the obsession loses its power. Not because the person becomes unimportant, not because the feelings were false, but because the architecture of the longing finally becomes visible, and visible things can be worked with. Invisible things only accumulate and expand until they fill the entire space of a life. You do not need to wait for them to come back. You do not need another person to reflect you back to yourself. You do not need the story to end differently in order to be okay. You are allowed to grieve what was lost and still recognize that what you were truly searching for was never in another person's hands. The love that heals the deepest wounds is not romantic. It is not conditional. It does not arrive from outside, and it cannot be taken away when someone leaves. It is the love you finally begin to practice toward yourself. The decision to stop abandoning your own needs in the hope that someone else will meet them. The commitment to being as present, as patient, and as kind with yourself as you always hoped someone else would be. That practice is not easy. It does not feel natural at first because for most people, the habit of self-abandonment is old and deep and woven into the ordinary texture of daily life. Putting yourself last, dismissing your own feelings, interpreting your needs as inconveniences, apologizing for taking up space. These patterns did not appear overnight and they do not dissolve overnight. But they do dissolve. With attention, with practice, with the repeated and genuine choice to treat yourself as someone worth caring for, worth listening to, worth staying with even when staying is uncomfortable. That is not a consolation prize for the love you lost. That is not a lesser substitute for the real thing. That is the source of every real love that will ever find its way to you. Every connection built on a foundation of genuine self-worth will carry a different quality than every connection you entered from a place of need. Not because the other person is different, but because you are. And who you are when you enter a relationship determines more than any other factor what that relationship becomes. Stop thinking about that person, not by force, not by distance, not by replacing them with something louder. Stop thinking about them by finally understanding what the obsession was always asking you to find. And then go find it. Not in a memory, not in a person, not in the hope that they will one day return and give you what you have been waiting for. Find it in yourself, where it has been waiting all along, patient and present and entirely yours, waiting only for you to stop looking elsewhere long enough to finally look within.